My father didn't lower his voice when he said it. He announced it like a commandment. Hand over. Your penthouse to your brother. It was supposed to be a wedding toast, but the ballroom went silent. Then his hand met my face so hard the string quartet missed a note. 200 guests watched as champagne froze midair and my cheek burned red. My mother's whisper cut sharper than the slap "You've humiliated us." I just smiled. Calm. Cold. Certain. Because right then, they didn't realize they hadn't just slapped their daughter. They'd created their biggest mistake. Before I tell you what happened next, hit like and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Have you ever had to stand alone against your own family? People think control looks loud. In my family, it never was. It sounded like advice, looked like concern, felt like love, until you realized you never got to choose anything for yourself. From the outside, we were the kind of family people admired. My father carried authority like it was part of his DNA. My mother perfected the art of saying everything without ever raising her voice. And my brother Carlos, he was always described the same way, full of potential. It didn't matter how many times he failed. That word stayed. Potential. And somehow, it was always my job to protect it. When he struggled in school, I adjusted my schedule to help him pass. When he lost jobs, I rewrote his applications until they sounded like someone worth hiring. When he wanted to start something new, I didn't just support him, I built the foundation he stood on. Not because I wanted to, because it was expected. There was never a moment where anyone sat me down and said, "This is your role." It was quieter than that. It showed up in the way my parents spoke about him like he was an investment, and about me like I was the insurance policy. My success wasn't celebrated. It was redirected. Every milestone I reached came with a follow-up question: how can this help your brother at? Some point I stopped answering. I moved out at 20 thinking distance would create boundaries. But distance didn't change expectation. It just made it harder to argue with. Because now every request came wrapped in guilt instead of instruction. By 31, I had built a life that didn't need their approval, a career I fought for, a routine that belonged to me, and a space finally that felt untouched by anyone else's decisions. The penthouse wasn't just expensive, it was quiet. No one knocking, no one asking, no one deciding. For the first time in my life, I wasn't supporting anyone else's future. I was living my own. When my parents came to visit, they walked through it, slowly taking everything in. My mother smiled in that measured way she always did, her fingers brushing over the edges of things like she was already familiar with them. "It's beautiful," she said. Then she looked at me. "It's more than you need." I didn't respond, because deep down I already knew. In my family, having something of your own was always temporary. Carlos got engaged the same way he did everything else, fast, loud, and just convincing enough to make people believe he had things under control. Vanessa was exactly what my parents had been waiting for. Polished, composed. The kind of woman who didn't ask questions, she assessed value. Standing next to Carlos, she made him look like a man who had finally figured things out. And that was enough. Because in my family, perception wasn't just important. It was everything. The wedding planning started immediately. Venues were booked before conversations were finished. Guest lists expanded overnight. Every detail was designed to say one thing: we are successful. It didn't seem to matter that Carlos couldn't sustain that image on his own. That part, like always, would be handled. At dinner one evening, my father watched me the way he always did when he was about to decide something. Not ask. Decide. This wedding, he said, slowly needs to set the tone for your brother's future. I kept my expression neutral, and my mother stepped in her tone soft but deliberate. He needs stability, something that reflects who he's becoming, not who he was, who he's becoming. Carlos didn't speak. He didn't need to. We all knew how this worked. My father leaned forward slightly. As his sister, you understand what that means. There it was again. Not a request, a reminder. A role I was expected to step into without hesitation. I let a few seconds pass. Say it clearly. My mother smiled. The penthouse would be perfect for them. No hesitation, no build-up. Just a decision that had already been made without me. I looked from one face to another, calm. Certain. You've already planned this, haven't you? My father didn't deny it. It's what's best for the family. That sentence had ended every argument I'd ever tried to start. But this time, it didn't land the same way. Because for the first time, I wasn't hearing obligation. I was hearing something else, ownership. And suddenly the penthouse didn't feel like the problem. It felt like proof that in their eyes, I had never actually owned anything at all. The wedding was exactly what my parents had envisioned, elegant, excessive, and carefully constructed to impress people who didn't know the truth behind it. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft gold light across the ballroom. Champagne glasses never stayed empty for more than a few seconds, and the orchestra played just loudly enough to fill any awkward silence that might have revealed how performative everything really was. From the outside, it looked like a celebration of love, of success, of a family that had done everything right. But I knew better, because I had helped build half the illusion standing in that room. I arrived on time, dressed simply but deliberately, choosing something that didn't compete for attention yet couldn't be overlooked either. And as I walked through the crowd, I could feel the subtle shift in conversations. The way people glanced at me, not with warmth, but with quiet recognition, the kind reserved for someone whose role in the story is important, but never fully acknowledged. My mother greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt more like a performance than affection, her smile perfectly in place as she adjusted a strand of my hair, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "Try not to make tonight about you." I almost laughed, because nothing about this night had ever been about me. Carlos, on the other hand, moved through the room like he belonged to it, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, introducing Vanessa as if he had personally built everything surrounding them. And maybe in his mind he had. Vanessa stayed close to his side, poised and observant, her eyes constantly scanning, calculating, absorbing the reactions of the guests as if she were measuring whether the image being presented was convincing enough. And my father, he watched. Not the guests, not the ceremony. Me. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but I had spent my entire life recognizing that look, the one he wore when he had already decided how something was going to end and was simply waiting for the right moment to make it official. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and applause, the kind of polished perfection that leaves no room for questions. And by the time the reception began, the energy in the room had shifted into something louder, looser, more confident, as if everyone believed the hardest part was over. That's when my father stood up. He didn't rush it. He never did. He adjusted his jacket, lifted his glass, and waited just long enough for the room to settle, for the conversations to quiet, for every eye to turn toward him with expectation instead of curiosity. "My son," he began, his voice steady, controlled, carrying effortlessly across the room, "has always been someone destined for more." There were nods, murmurs of agreement, a few polite smiles. And tonight, he continued, marks the beginning of the life he was meant to have. I felt it before he said it, that shift. That moment when something stops being a speech and starts becoming a decision. And as a family, he added, turning his gaze directly toward me. We all have a role in making sure that future is secured. The room didn't react yet. They didn't understand. Not until he said it. Clear, direct, unquestionable. Diana will be handing over her penthouse to her brother. For a second, it was like the entire ballroom forgot how to breathe. No one laughed. No one clapped. Even the orchestra faltered, the music breaking just slightly, just enough to make the silence feel louder than anything that had come before it. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. Because in that moment, I understood something with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. This was never about helping. It was about obedience. And when I didn't immediately comply, when I didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't step into the role they had already written for me, that's when his hand came across my face, fast, precise, final. The sound cut through the room sharper than the music ever could. And I felt the impact before I fully registered what had happened. The sting spreading across my cheek as 200 people watched in stunned silence, unsure whether they had just witnessed a mistake or something far more intentional. My mother leaned in immediately, her expression unchanged, her voice low and controlled, as if she were correcting a minor inconvenience rather than responding to what had just happened. "You've humiliated us." And that was the moment everything shifted. Not when he hit me, but when I realized they truly believed I had done something wrong. I slowly lifted my head, meeting his eyes, then hers, then the room, and I smiled. Not out of weakness, not out of shock, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't confused about who they were anymore. The bruise didn't show up immediately, at least not the kind anyone else could see. The morning after the wedding, the city outside my window looked exactly the same as it always did. Traffic, flowing people, moving. Sunlight cutting through glass like nothing had shifted but inside me. Something had settled into place with a kind of quiet finality that felt more permanent than anger. My phone started ringing before I even got out of bed. At first I ignored it. Then the messages began. Not outrage, not concern, correction. My aunt. You should have handled that better. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. He's still your father, Diana. A family friend, you embarrassed him in front of everyone. Not one message asked if I was okay. Not one mentioned the slap. It was as if the only thing that had actually happened was me refusing to play my part. By noon, the narrative had already been decided, shaped, and distributed without me. I was difficult, uncooperative, ungrateful. Carlos texted next. You didn't have to make a scene. Vanessa's upset. Mom says you owe Dad an apology. I stared at the screen longer than I expected to, not because I was considering it, but because I was trying to understand how something so obvious could be so completely invisible to all of them. Then I did something small but irreversible. I blocked his number. For the rest of the day, the silence that followed felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room that had always been occupied and suddenly finding it empty. Not peaceful yet, but no longer controlled. That lasted until Thursday. The knock on my door came mid-morning, firm, confident, not the kind that asked for permission. When I opened it, Carlos was already stepping forward, Vanessa right behind him, dressed like she was arriving for a showing rather than a visit, her eyes moving past me into the apartment before I had even said a word. We won't take long, he said casually, holding a coffee in one hand like this was routine, like this had already been agreed upon somewhere I hadn't been included. For what I asked, even though I already knew. Vanessa lifted a small notebook, flipping it open as she walked inside without waiting. Just measurements, she said. Furniture, layout, a few adjustments. We want everything ready before we move in. Move in? The words didn't hit like a shock. They landed like confirmation. I stepped in front of her, blocking the hallway, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. You're not moving in. Carlos sighed, the kind of tired, rehearsed frustration that suggested I was the only one complicating something simple. Don't do this, he said. You heard Dad, this is already decided. There it was again. Decided. Always decided, never discussed. I held his gaze for a few seconds longer than I ever had before, long enough for something in his expression to shift. Not doubt, not yet, but recognition that something about this interaction wasn't following the usual pattern. No, I said quietly, it isn't. Vanessa stopped moving then, her pen hovering above the page as she looked at me properly for the first time. Not assessing the space, but assessing me. Carlos let out a short laugh, shaking his head like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. You're one person. You don't need all this. That sentence used to work on me. It used to make me explain, justify, shrink things down into something more acceptable. But this time it just sounded empty. You need to leave, I said. Not louder, just final. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Carlos scoffed, muttering something under his breath as he turned toward the door, Vanessa following a second later, though not before taking one last look around the penthouse like she was memorizing it. Not admiring, claiming. When the door closed behind them, the silence that filled the apartment felt different from before, not uncertain, not fragile, just clear. Because for the first time, it wasn't about whether they would push. It was about how far I was willing to let them. And for the first time, the answer wasn't far enough. By that evening, the silence didn't last. It never did. My phone lit up with a notification that looked harmless. At first, just another group chat. The kind families create for holidays or birthdays, but the name told me everything I needed to know before I even opened it. Family coordination. New living arrangements. There were 12 people in it. 12. Not one of them had been there when I was slapped. Not one of them had asked what actually happened, but now suddenly, they all had opinions. The messages came in quickly, overlapping, building on each other like this had already been discussed somewhere else, and I was just catching up to a decision that had already been finalized: paint colors, furniture layouts, move-in timelines. My mother's message sat near the top. Calm and precise as always, Carlos and Vanessa will transition into the penthouse in 2 weeks. Let's keep things smooth for everyone. Transition, not request, not discussion. Just another word that removed me from the equation. I scrolled through the messages slowly, not because I was trying to understand them, but because I was watching something unfold that I had lived through my entire life, just more. Organized this time, more visible, more deliberate. This wasn't pressure. This was coordination, a system. Every person in that chat playing a role, reinforcing the same idea from different angles until resistance felt unreasonable, until saying no felt like creating a problem that didn't need to exist. And for years, that system had worked on me, not because I agreed with it, but because it was easier to give in than to stand alone against it. My phone buzzed again. My father. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "You've made this difficult enough," he said without greeting, his voice already carrying that familiar edge of control disguised as disappointment. "We're not doing this back and forth. The arrangements are already in motion." I leaned against the counter, looking out over the city, my reflection faint in the glass. "No," I said calmly. "They're not." There was a pause on the other end, short but sharp. "You don't get to decide that," he replied. And that was the moment something shifted completely. Not because of what he said, but because of how it landed. For the first time, it didn't feel like authority. It felt like assumption. And assumptions could be broken. "I already did," I said, my voice steady, almost quiet. He exhaled sharply, "The patience gone now. Then you're choosing to go against your own family." I didn't answer right away, because that sentence used to mean something. It used to carry weight, consequence, fear. Now, standing alone in a space I had built for myself, it sounded like something else entirely, like a threat that only worked if I still believed I belonged to them. Maybe I said finally, or maybe I'm just choosing myself. The line went silent. Then he hung up. No warning. No last word. Just silence. I lowered the phone slowly, setting it down on the counter as the city lights flickered on outside one by one, steady and indifferent to everything that had just shifted inside that room. For a long moment, I didn't move, not because I didn't know what came next, but because I did. And for the first time, it wasn't about how they were going to push harder. It was about what I was going to do when they did. Because this time, I wasn't waiting for them to decide anything. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was overwhelmed or hurt or even angry in the way I might have been before, but because, for the first time, my mind wasn't trying to process what had happened. It was mapping what came next, calmly, precisely like something that had been waiting for permission to surface. By morning, the decision wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. I called Jasmine first. She had been my friend long before she became my attorney, which meant she didn't waste time pretending this was anything less than what it was. "They're not asking," she said after I finished explaining. "They're positioning." "I know," I replied. "I'm done responding to that." There was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, but recognition. "Good," she said. "Then we stop this before it escalates further." By noon, I was sitting across from her in her office, sunlight cutting across the table between us while I laid everything out, not just the messages from the past week, but patterns, expectations. Years of conversations that had always been framed as support, but functioned as control. She read through it quietly, her expression sharpening with every page. "This is enough to establish harassment," she said finally. "Possibly coercion depending on how far they push. They're already pushing," I replied. Then we document everything she said, and we get ahead of it. Ahead. That word mattered. Because for most of my life, I had been reacting, adjusting, absorbing. This time, I was setting the direction. After I left her office, I called Marcus. If Jasmine understood the legal side, Marcus understood something just as important: the environment Carlos was operating in. We met at a cafe near his office, the kind of place where conversations blended into background noise and no one paid attention, unless you gave them a reason to. "You were right," he said before I even sat down. "He's been talking. About what I asked." "About moving into your place," Marcus replied, lowering his voice slightly. "Telling people it's part of a transition, like it was always the plan. He's using it to position himself more stable, more established. I felt something settle at that, not shock, not even anger, but confirmation. And no one questioned it, I asked. Marcus gave a small shrug. Why would they? He's been dropping your name for months. Makes it sound like everything he has access to is something he earned. Earned. That word lingered, because it wasn't just about the penthouse anymore. It was about narrative, about who was seen as building something and who was expected to quietly support it from the keys. Background. Keep listening, I said. Anything else he says I want to know. Marcus nodded, studying me for a moment longer than usual. You're not just stopping this, are you? I met his gaze calm, certain in a way that felt different from before. No, I said. I'm finishing it. When I stepped back out into the city, the air felt sharper, clearer, like everything had shifted just slightly into focus, and for the first time, I wasn't trying to hold something together. I was preparing to take it apart, piece by piece, on my terms. By the end of the week, they stopped pretending. The messages slowed down, but the pressure didn't. It shifted from words to action. Reynolds, the head of security in my building, called me late Friday afternoon. His tone professional, but edged with something that told me this wasn't routine. You might want to take a look at this, he said. He sent the footage a few minutes later. Carlos and Vanessa were standing outside my door, not knocking, not waiting, testing. Vanessa held her phone up at one point, angling it carefully, smiling as she took a picture in front of the entrance like it already belonged to her, while Carlos leaned in close to the keypad, trying combinations with the casual persistence of someone who believed access was only a matter of time. I watched the clip twice, then a third time, not because I needed to understand what they were doing, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain of what they had just confirmed. This wasn't pressure anymore. It was entitlement without permission. I forwarded the footage to Jasmine without a message. She replied almost immediately. This helps a lot. I stared at the screen for a moment, then closed it, setting my phone down as I walked toward the window, the city stretching out below me, distant and steady, untouched by the quiet escalation that had just crossed a line no one in my family had ever acknowledged before. For years, they had relied on one assumption, that no matter how far they pushed, I would adjust, compromise, give in. But standing there watching the reflection of a life I had built without them, I realized something with complete clarity. They hadn't just crossed a boundary. They had removed the last reason I had to hold back. The legal notice went out on Monday. No confrontation, no raised voices, no final argument, just documents. Clear, final, unmistakable. By the end of the week, the messages stopped. The calls didn't come back. The silence that followed wasn't the kind I used to fear. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't lonely. It was mine. For the first time, there was no expectation waiting behind it. No role I had to step into. No version of myself I had to shrink into just to keep the peace. They thought they were taking something from me. The truth was they were the last thing I needed to let go of. And once I did, there was nothing left they could control.